This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Peter Normanton. Salutations, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and today I talk with Peter Normanton. His new book, It Crept from the Tomb, came out recently from TwoMorrows Publishing, and I have an informative conversation with Peter about his fascination with the horror genre and his experience in British fan culture. But before we get to that interview, I'm here to tell you that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And since today I'm talking with Peter Normanton, it's worth pointing out that DCB Service is a great place to find releases from TwoMorrows Publishing. There you can find the latest issues of Alter Ego, Back Issue, Comic Book Creator, and the Jack Kirby Collector, and you can also get many TwoMorrows books at impressive 25% discounts. There's no better way to catch up on your comic book history than checking out the great prices at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. On past episodes of the Comics Alternative, we've discussed comics fandom and zine culture quite often, although usually the context surrounds American fan activity. As I point out in my conversation with Peter Normanton, I have little knowledge of fanzines outside of the States, particularly within the United Kingdom. That's why Peter's latest book, It Crept from the Tomb, was such an enlightening read. Normanton was the publisher and editor of the UK horror zine From the Tomb, which began in 2000 and ran for over 20-some issues. Several years ago, he was approached by Roy Thomas about the possibility of editing a collection from the pages of his horror zine, and the result was the best of From the Tomb, which came out from TwoMorrows Publishing in 2012. Then, more recently, John Morrow asked Peter about a second best of collection surrounding From the Tomb, and this is Peter's newest release, It Crept from the Tomb. In my conversation with Peter Normanton, I talk with him about his time as an editor and publisher, the history of comics in the UK, his love of the horror genre and comics fandom, and the many challenges he faced in putting out a fanzine over the years. This was a fun interview, but I should warn you that over the course of our conversation, we had occasional problems with the internet connection. Peter lives in Northwest Britain, and at times our connection on Skype was sketchy. So I apologize in advance for the several breaks and momentary silences that are noticeable on Peter's track. Still, the gist of his comments comes through clearly, and I hope that you'll overlook any technical difficulties we may have had. I'm very pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Peter Normanton. His new book, It Crept from the Tomb, was released in March from TwoMorrows Publishing. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Derek. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, and you and I had planned on talking about a month or two earlier, but it seemed like one thing after another was conspiring against us.
It has been, hasn't it? It's been odd. Gremlins in the network.
That's it. But, you know, now that we have a couple of months under your belt since the publication of It Crept from the Tomb, you may have a better sense of some of the reaction that the book has been receiving.
Yeah, it's been very positive. I've had some, really nice emails coming back to me, and it's got me interested in going out doing other things again. So, yeah, I think John's been pleased with the way things have gone. So, yeah, so far so good. Yes.
Now, maybe the most logical place to begin in our conversation of the new book is for you to describe what From the Tomb was.
Yeah, back in the day, it was just really an amateur fan publication. I started in about 2000. It was meant really to be studied on any weekends and in evenings during the winter. It's something I'd wanted to do since I was in my teens. And the first just 4 sheets stapled together, put into an A5 pamphlet format, and it took off from there. And a friend of mine said at the time, he says, "Pete says from small acorns," and things have just spiraled. I can't believe what's happened to me this last it's 18 years now. It's gone quickly. And it was really, I wanted to just get my great love and passion for old horror comics. I was brought up in the 1970s when I first started reading horror comics. And then when it got to the early 90s, I started to be able to get hold of EC comics from the 1950s, something that I'd always wanted to do. And I knew by about 1992 I wanted to do a fan publication in EC. Well, then there were so many great EC zines, I could never match those. And I realised my interest in horror comics spanned all the publishers. So I started to put notes together. And initially, I started to work on the amateur press on a Lovecraft fanzine, H.P. Lovecraft fanzine, Strange. Callan McIver was putting together up on the sky. We exchanged a few notes. I really liked what he was doing. And he said, "Well, do you fancy doing something from me?" So I started to write about the old horror books from the 1950s, and people liked it. So From the Tomb was certainly going to happen, but that was the thing that said to me, "Yeah, there's interest out there, and we'll give it a go." And it's just grown. I had a good 10-year run. Unfortunately, the recession brought it to an end. But John Morrow stepped in, Pete Crowther at PS in, and somehow we managed to keep things going all this time. And it's just really conveying both my love and a lot of other people who've on board and written for these old daft, crazy old comics. Yeah, that's what it's all about, really.
One of the things I found fascinating about both the new book, It Crept from the Tomb, and your first book about From the Tomb, The Best of From the Tomb, which came out in 2012, is the fact that this is in many ways kind of a historical document, if you want to call it that, of a certain aspect of fan culture and fanzines in the UK, which is something I have to tell you that I'm completely ignorant of before I picked up your books.
Yeah.
I mean, I know some about what fan culture in terms of comics, horror, and otherwise has been like here in the United States, but I really knew nothing about the UK fan base, fanzine culture. And so this was an eye-opener, not so much in terms of the content of the various pieces that you collect in these two books, but some of the details that come through in the selection. So, for instance, I don't think I was aware that in the 1950s and 60s, for a while, you guys in the UK had versions of American comic books, but they were in black and white, not the 4-color.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, these are highly collectible and very much sought after now. They're very rare because, of course, in over here in Scotland and Wales, it was very much a throwaway culture. It wasn't like it was in America where people were hoarding stuff when it's certain people who held onto this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I didn't start till the late 60s, 70s, but people like Barry Forshaw, Mottler, Pete Crowther, they were buying these stuff in the late 50s and picking them from second-hand stalls, second-hand shops. The stuff that was about in the late 40s, early 50s. Fascinating. I love it when they tell me all the stories about visiting these junk shops and finding these comics. I just love those stories. They took me back to my youth, my childhood. But when they're talking about these comics, you're like, it's something special because they are so rare. If you get an EC published by the Arnold Book Company, I mean, these are really, really treasured comics. They really are. I mean, they're quite special. But again, all in black and white, quite different to what you were getting in America. Yeah.
Now, I mean, I know that the UK has a rich tradition in comics, but specifically when it comes to horror comics, tell me about the history of horror releases in terms of comics in the United Kingdom.
Well, really, it did start in the 1950s with the reprints of American comics, and these I think the legislation it's about the same time as it did in America. It's about 1954, 55, and they had to tone things down. And it's really companies like Miller and then Alan Class, a company called Streamline and the Arnold Book Company. They're about in the 50s. And then about 1959, 60, Alan Class starts to reprint a lot of these comics, but they weren't the comics that people get in the 19s, say like the pre-code horror, that was banned. You couldn't do that over here. So what we got was a lot of reprint of like the early Marvel sort of pre-superhero type stuff. A lot of American comic stuff. A lot of those stories are reprinted, and Charlton as well from the late 50s, early 60s. Those were about, they were big in seaside resorts. These comics, you went to the seaside, there was always loads of them to be had. And then I think in the 1970s, when horror starts to take off again in America, we got reprints. The one in this one was Dracula Lives, which was my favourite. I love that comic. I bought every one of them. And then there was reprints of the Skyward stuff, so about Psycho and Nightmare, and there was a few Warren reprints of Creepy and Vampirella. And then there was one, I haven't got it on. There was like a series of digest-sized comics. I can't remember the name. I can't remember these, but there was like individual stories in each issue, and you rarely ever saw these where I was. There's something I've only found in the last few years. So they were going, and then Des Skin started a House of Hammer magazine, which was primarily and reported on what was going on at the moment, but there was always a Hammer adaptation in there. Which we got some fancy. We've got people like John Bolton doing that with Brian Bolland, and then there'll be stories at the back which were quite gory stories. I think Skin has just collected these together again, so it might be with people looking out for this. He's put a new 80-page book together on these House of Hammer, and that was a biggie for me. That really, really inspired me. That's the way I wanted to do things. And then, of course, we started to get all the American stuff. And I think IPC, they had a couple. One was Scream, was Misty, which was directed at girls. It was, that was their target audience. But that now is such a collectible comic. They're really hard to get hold of because we're coming out every week. And again, it's a typical British thing. Comics were throwaway culture. They weren't serious. So they've become very, very collectible. And then as the 80s came along, a lot of smaller publishers were coming on board and getting out into direct sales comics. We saw little bits of things coming through in America. But there were certainly things going on and building. But the early 50s, the 1970s were big on the horror side. They were. That was the big time for them. Yeah.
So things kind of got really going when it came to the reprints. It was that really launched an interest in horror comics in the UK.
It was, yes. Yeah, you weren't getting a great deal of... There's the odd, very, very obscure. But really, they were American reprints. They were... and we thrived on them. We loved them. Yeah.
And, we've primarily been talking about the horror genre in terms of From the Tomb, but as I guess you can find in several of the pieces that you have in this new book, not everything that you and your colleagues wrote about in From the Tomb dealt exclusively or even specifically with horror. For instance, one of the earlier essays in this new book is a piece that you had written about the comic books and Cold War culture.
Yeah.
And so basically, I mean, there is something kind of frightening about the atomic bomb, of course, but what you do is you're specifically interested in how Cold War politics, the threat of nuclear annihilation and all of that kind of found itself manifested in comics from the 1940s on.
Yeah. It's something that fascinates. I think we're Cold War kids, and now you can look back on it with fascination. At the time, things are good, and you start to look. I did it as part of my degree. That sort of sparked my interest in what was really only a few before. I was at university 1983, and I was doing this about 1981. It was, we were talking about things that were only 20 years stuff. And it fascinated me how in the 1950s stuff you could see the paranoia seeping through, the Reds under the bed, the communists, the fear of communism. And it just fascinated me. I needed to know both sides. I mean, I've read an awful lot on the situation, the Soviet Union, East Germany just fascinated me, all the things that were going on the Berlin Wall. And it translated to comics because, Atlas did a lot of things. And it was there, you can see reading a lot of the early Marvel superhero stuff, this last 6 months. And you can see how it creeps in there, this fear, the Soviet spectre, what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. And affected comic, not just the horror comics, but obviously there was science fiction involved. There'd be elements of the crime comics where they'd be accused of being a communist. It got into romance comics again. It's fascinating. It seemed to be affecting everything about that time, and it's just something that's there's I think on the way it affected the comic book industry, and they thrived on it. They I think they were enjoying what was going on. They're not saying they're enjoying the situation, but the fact that they could latch onto this and produce these amazing stories that we've come to love all.
Mm-hmm. And then we have a somewhat similar piece, similar to your essay on the Cold War in comics, by Frank Mottler, that's also in this new book, A Brighter Tomorrow, the promotional comics of the Cold War.
Yes. Yeah, Frank loves these. He's got an amazing collection of promotional comics. I've sat them with it at his house, and it was one of those things. He said to me, I want to write about this. I do want to get people don't know about what was going on. I said, again, we talk about comics being Norway culture in this country, but something like those pamphlets now, they've been, they would have come and gone, but yet they've got in cultural history, and of course, comic books do come from that. And honestly, when we discussed it, I think, this is going to be there's going to be people there who were there in the Cold War, maybe grew up were born in the late 40s and grew up in the 90s. They'll remember this kind of thing and how frightening it was. And I was so chuffed when he put it together because it's quite a big piece he did, and there was so many notes on it. We had to cut the notes out because it would have gone on forever. But he really put his heart and soul into it. We just think it plays its part in the horror and science fiction comics of the period. You can't just view it in isolation. There is this connection there. And we thought it was worth doing it, and because we wanted to run it in, we hoped to bring From the Tomb back a few years ago, and that was one of the articles that was lined up. PS Publishing had hoped to publish it. The PS are sort of one of the largest independent science fiction horror fan publishers in And Pete Crowther was really interested in doing it. Unfortunately, he had too much work on his plate, and he just couldn't do it. I mean, I could see what was going on. I thought, Pete's just too busy, and he was about it when he had to say he just couldn't do it. But we used the material because we discussed, what we were going to do, and we just thought, yeah, it all fits together, and it gives people a broader perspective. It wasn't just the comics; there were other things as well. And again, it's part of mine and Frank was the same as me, fascination with the Cold War years. We grew up at this time. Yeah.
You're mentioning your work with Frank Mottler. I'm curious that we have a variety of contributors in not only this new book at Crept from the Tomb, but your first From the Tomb collection, the best of From the Tomb from 2012.
Yeah.
How did you, with the original From the Tomb zine, how did you come about finding contributors?
I think I first met him about 1995, and I was just amazed, his knowledge, and that other people would get on board. And with the first issue, Frank said, I'll do something for you, I'll supply some notes. And then there was a chap who, Peter Garriott. Peter Garriott, he'd done, I think, the Masters of Comic Book Art in about 1970, first book about comics, and I couldn't believe it when Peter Garriott got on the phone and told me it was him and what he'd done. I said, that's my first ever book. I said, I'd like to do something for you. We can do the research. So they came on very quickly, and then about the seventh issue, Pete Crowther dropped me a line. He'd found a comic, the issue 7 From the Tomb, in a shop in Leeds. And he was just so excited about what I was doing. He couldn't believe somebody else had the same passion. So he came on board. There were many people just dropped me a line once it got going. They'd write, I fancy doing something for you. And I was lucky. I got a really good crop of writers, people who were enthusiastic about our hobby. I was very, very fortunate. I mean, Barry Forshaw, he works for the National Press. He works for the Financial Times. He works for the Guardian, writing the crime column, on crime culture. So I was so fortunate having these people. I couldn't believe it. It made a big impact when Al Feldstein he let me use the cover for issue 4 From the Tomb. And I think people then realised there's something going on here. And he just grew from there. It was just people who just wanted to come on board and contribute. And I was lucky. I mean, the standard of writing was excellent, and that their research was first class. They supplied me with more progressing my sort of projects I was on at the time. And I think it was just a set of like-minded people coming together. With a passion for things. I think some of these chaps had written back in the 1970s for the fan press in the UK, and it just really grew and grew. I think it was just the enthusiasm everybody had that this brought more and more people in to come on board writing, and we got such a wealth of material there. I mean, one of the best of. There was so many other articles I would like to include, but John Morrow would have not been too happy with me submitting the 400-page book. I mean, it would have cost us a fortune. So that's really how it came about that way, yeah.
Well, tell me your experience as a publisher and editor of fanzines. What were some of the biggest challenges you faced? I mean, obviously, you seem to have a fairly easy time finding good quality contributors, but in terms of the technical aspect of putting out From the Tomb, what were some of those uphill slogs?
Yeah, well, in the early days, it was, I think the first thing I had to get was the software. I think it was Microsoft Publisher in those days. And then my wife kindly bought me a scanner for as a Christmas present in Christmas 1999, so I could get the image together. So I had to learn all this. You were starting from fresh. I managed to get myself a second-hand copy of Adobe Photoshop, one of the very early ones. And I started to and it was a matter of learning all this. But part of it as well was my PC by that time was about 5 years old, and it was starting to struggle. So really one of the big things was technology. and teaching yourself. The next one was distribution, just getting it out to people. What I'd do, I'd just sample issues out to comic shops. And there were certain comic shops I knew from being involved with the fan press before and keeping up with things. I could get odd copies out to those, and they could get them out to people. And then Des Skin was running the Comics International, which was like the big British comics. And Des was really helpful. I got a review in there that just... And I was lucky. My friend Ken Harmon, who was a friend of Frank Motley's, he was a comic book dealer down in London. He'd take things out for me. There was in Manchester, they'd do a few for me. And it was just done bit by bit. And it wasn't until issue 8, Bud Plank became interested, and he took 150 copies, which was phenomenal. And I had to print all these up manually. I had to use I used to photocopy up the black and white sections at work, but it was getting too much even for the works photocopy. I couldn't start abusing things, so I had to go to a print shop across the road. They did the photocopying, but it was growing out of control, and I was basically printing all the time to keep it going, because it was on. I had an A3 Hewlett Packard printer, a whole series of it, and they were absolutely brilliant. They were real stalwarts. They kept me going for the first 2 or 3 years from the two. And in the end, a chap called John Anderson stepped in. He runs a company store in Penguin who looks after people like me. And John said to me, we could get this out to people. I could get you into Diamond, get you into previews, and we could get you into America. He said, we'll have to do it step by step. I'm not making big promises. He said, I can get you a printer who could do it nice. You'll have to come up with the money, and we'll take it from there. He said, I think... I said, again, sort of the amateur side, he said, they had a forum down in London where John's based. And he said, people talk about all these things, but he said, John talks about them, but he does them. He says he will look after you. And it did, it worked. It was quite amazing. Once John got involved, he handled all the bits I didn't like, the distribution and dealing with printers. To John, he made it look easy. We tightened everything up. He taught me many things. And from really John coming involved with the 9th issue, things got so much easier. I just had to concentrate on getting the magazine together. And I just lived and breathed it, really, for 10 years. And it was very disappointing when recession kept in and Diamond had to the bottom end of their sales. We always knew we were batting out of our league, so you can't gripe. And that was sad, and so we had to do it then again without Diamond and try and do all the internet, but with the cost of posts and getting things to the States, we just couldn't do it. I mean, the last 2 issues, I still have a lot of copies left because we just couldn't get them out to people. The one that will hold anybody back when you start to go down this line is getting a distributor and it's getting out to people. And that's your biggest hurdle. Everything else really went reasonably smoothly. I was very fortunate, but you've got to give it the time and don't expect to be making money out of it. You'll be throwing money at it because it is, to me, always what. Tell this out to people, I don't think it's a money earner. It's not. The books, yes, they'll bring things in for you, but you've got to come in through this end. But it was fantastic, absolutely brilliant.
You were talking just now about the challenges when it comes to distribution in getting a wider audience. First off in the UK, but also across the pond here in the United States or in North America. In what other ways did an expanded audience, beyond a British readership, change what you were doing, if any, from the Tomb?
Well, once you got into the States, you mean, did it change anything I was doing? Sorry, it was a bit garbled. The line was breaking there, Derek.
Our connection is a little sketchy at times. And by the way, we should apologize to our listeners that Peter and I are talking on a Skype connection. He is in Lancaster, and I'm here in the United States in Texas. And so we have a connection that for the most part sounds okay, but every now and again may crackle in and out. But Peter, what I'd ask was, did an expanded readership beyond the UK change what you were doing with From the Tomb in any way?
No, it didn't. No, because even early on, there was plenty of American readers from very, very early days. People latched on to it, so it didn't change anything we're doing. If anything, really, I was lucky enough to get contributors from the States, and then I had people like Pete Von Scholly doing covers for me, and Eric Pagos, who worked for Disney. So anything. It made things so much better for me. But I didn't have to change my approach at all. No. I wanted it to be sort of the British perspective on things, and there were the things that had gone over here. American culture was had such an impact on us. So that's where I was always driving. So that didn't change. If anything, it just encouraged me.
Mm. You said just now something about a British perspective is what you wanted to bring. I'm curious, how you think when it comes to horror comics, or perhaps even the horror genre in a broader sense, right? So beyond comics, horror. How might the British perspective be different from, let's say, the American or the non-British perspective?
I think things are a lot more staid over here. Certainly they were back in the 1970s. All things are changing now. So we've been a lot more reserved. So when you were getting films like Halloween and Friday the 13th over here, it was a real shock. We couldn't wait to get to the pictures. And of course we were getting stuff as well at the time, Suspiria. And it did. I do love British horror movies. I'm a big Hammer fan. I love the Amicus movies. But with the sign at the time, I think they're all, I'm not saying twee, but we are a lot more reserved over here. And I do love them for that. But when we were coming from America, and of course Italy, and they're having a field day over there, it was very different. It was. There were boundaries here. I think people in comics and in film, they probably wouldn't go over. Although House of Hammer magazine was quite a gory publication, it did really gruesome stories in there. So I think Dead Kids people probably were a little bit like me. But I think once you start to see these films, it did open things up here and things changed. But that's not saying there weren't some great horror movies over here. Just big as in America and, say, Italy and Spain. Nowhere near as big.
We should also mention that you're also the author of a book that came out several years ago, The Mammoth Book of Slasher Movies, an A to Z guide to over 60 years of blood and guts.
That's right, yeah. Off the back of the Mammoth Book of Horror Comics, it was going to second print, and the chap who was looking after me, my editor, he said, "Yeah, fancy having a go at this?" I said, "Well, yeah, I've always had an interest in these films." And initially, they were interested in the whole. The book was initially going to be the Mammoth Book of Slasher and Splatter Movies, and I said, "Well, there's two things. There's two books here." But they were a bit reluctant because, of course, recession come in. It was a new area for them. The Mammoth book series had done well for me in the past. So they offered me the chance to come up with your ideas. And I had all sorts of notes on these films I'd put together over the years. And it was great to go back into them, a little bits of notes here, because I used references when I was doing From the Tomb. It would help me with that. So they gave me the chance to do it. And it was always going to be the Mammoth Book of Slasher and Splatter. Submitted the whole thing. It was 9 months and it was a slog because I was working full time. And right at the last, the people on the publicity side said, "No, it's too much of a mouthful." They said it's going to be the Mammoth Book of Slasher Movies. And I said, "I know what they're saying." I pretty much said, "They're going to chew us up here. They will not like it because a lot of those films are splatter movies. They're not slasher movies." And that was a toughie. That was a toughie for all of us, I think, that one. The fact we were overruled at the end on the title of the book. But it was a joy. But it was hard work. But I was watching it. I think I overdosed. I was giving myself nightmares at the end. You're going over so many of these films and going back to them. But what it did, the problem was in the early 80s with a friend of mine, Nick. He was a big horror movie fan. He was my best man many years ago. we overdosed on these films. We said at the time, I said, we just watched two. So that by the time it got to Nightmare on Elm Street, I never went to see Nightmare on Elm Street. I'd done it. I'd been there. I bought the book and bought more than the first share of T-shirts. And it was only a few years after, really, wife who got me back into horror with Stephen King. She was a big Stephen King fan. So when I came to do this book, it rekindled some passion for Italian horror movies, and Dario Argento became. I bought loads of his films. I couldn't get enough of them, and I really got into European horror movies. How much good stuff there was out there, and again, I'm a kid who's brought up in the 70s, 80s. That was my, teens, early 20s. These are the films I enjoyed, and I think I was criticised that people didn't like the fact I didn't cover the remakes. But for me, the remakes, it's already been done. It's been done the first time we mentioned the remakes. But I wanted to really concentrate on why, this was the great age of slasher films, the late 70s, going into the mid-1980s. And of course, the splatter phenomenon carried on. It's going now. But it was one I was going back to so much stuff from my past. And I wish I'd had more time to do the book. I wish I'd had another 6 months to get what I would have wanted. Because I was, at the time, I was working full time. And it was watching so much stuff, you were noting stuff, and then you'd have to put it together. And I think that book got, because of the problems with the title, it did get up to a bit of a shaky start. But then it settled, and people came back and said, yeah, we did enjoy it, we knew what you were saying. With that, because we did have fun doing it. I mean, the publishers were great. They were always good with me, very, very good with me, very patient, curbing my enthusiasm.
You mentioned your earlier book, the Mammoth book of best horror comics, and I think that was published by Running Press in 2008. Is that it?
Yeah. Because over here it was Constable and Robinson, and I think over in the States it was Running Press, wasn't it? Yeah, I mean that came about in last part of 2006. I was asked by the publisher, did I fancy doing a book on it? Couldn't believe my luck, because From the Tomb was up to about issue 20 by then, and I thought, this is fantastic. So I got the chance to go back and select all the stories I would have wanted in there. We were there was things like EC, Atlas, and DC we couldn't do. They were copyrighted. We couldn't touch them. I wanted things from House of Hammer. I spoke to Deskin, and he said the legal problems with it are too involved. He said we couldn't unravel it in time. And there were people I couldn't get hold of. I couldn't get hold of Jim Warren. I couldn't get hold of the Gertz who just done the covers for the last two books. So there were other things I would have liked in there, but in the end, there was so much stuff we got. Selection of material. And when I was contacting people, they were just so delighted to contribute and said, yeah, they just wanted to be involved. 4 months. But it was an absolute joy. And I think I produced the book. Loved when I was about 13, 14 years old. If my parents had bought me that book at that age, and it was nice when the book did come out. I was looking at comments on the net. I mean, you wanted to see what the feedback was. There was a group of young lads on some Marvel forum, and this lad had got it, and he said, how wonderful it was. And his mate said, my mum's getting me for my birthday, I can't wait. And I thought, oh, brilliant, I'm going to make that lad's birthday a little bit special. I hope it wasn't the most special thing that happened for him that day, but that was really nice. And it was just, people were so helpful, and it was a slog. I'd be working till the early hours of the morning and getting up to work in the morning, but it was worth it. It was like an adrenaline rush for 4 months. And even at the last, the publishers were changing their minds. We need this, we need that. And some of the writing, it wasn't good, because I was doing it in a matter of days, just at the death to get this thing to balance. But the help I had from people around, over in the States, over here, to make that book work was absolutely fantastic, and it really gave me a taste for how good these projects can be. And the book went down well. I still remember the day when it came out. I think my wife and I went to a restaurant together, and we had our opening. the book promotion party, just the two of us. We toasted the book that day, and it was fantastic. If anybody gets a chance something like that, take it. Yeah, definitely take it, because I could go back to I'm going through about reading all my favourite stories, and it just opened more things up from the tomb as well, and more people got interested in it, and it gave me more ideas as well. So, fantastic experience, wonderful experience.
Now, you mentioned in compiling everything for the Mammoth book of best horror comics that you were limited, especially in terms of the classic EC material, in that it was a little out of your price range, and also it may have involved more time than you had in order to jump through the various hoops in order to get the rights to republish. What were some of the other considerations that went into what you would collect in this Mammoth book of best horror comics? Because, I mean, there are a lot of horror comics.
Oh, yes, there are. Yeah, I wanted a lot of stuff. I wanted to cover each decade. And certainly, I think the emphasis had to be on the pre-cut material. Now, on the pre-cut stuff, there's so much good stuff out there. I mean, we had the Harvey stuff in, we had Fawcett stuff. We had Rudy Palais stories in there. Yeah, I went through all my favourite artists, and the artists who I thought difference to the way comics were being done. People like Rudy Palais just defied. I think Harvey got frustration with him because he wouldn't stay within the panels. He wanted to just throw it all over the page. Well, people like me love that kind of thing. So, Rudy Palais had to be in there. Matt Fox. When 1992, I fell in love with his stuff. Matt had to be in there. But, of course, 99% of the stuff he did was with Atlas. And there was about one story I think we could get that was about the old Marvel Comics people. So I had people that I thought had made a difference, and then we had to represent each of the decades, and I wanted to do that to show how things had changed. And again, there was just so much good material. Okay, we couldn't use Marvel and DC. I tried also, I had Bernie Wrightson's phone number, God bless him. One of the chaps, he gave it to me, and I said, "You can't give this to anybody." He said, "Just explain the situation." But I could not get hold of Bernie, so we couldn't get any of his stuff in there. But there was just so much good material. Having done From the Tomb, there was plenty I wanted to do. I mean, there were so many things we didn't say from the Tomb in its 28 issues. But this book was just adding to it all the time, and I think I'd learned so much. The book could have been given the fact the original draft was approaching 600 pages.
Wow.
And the publisher said, "We're going to have to pull it back." He said, "We just can't do all this." Because they'd asked for more notes. I suggested at the beginning we should do a notes on each decade and each of the stories to show it in context. Right, the last 4 days to go, I said, "We think we could do with the notes." We found out it's probably a better idea. So I had to cobble all that together. So in the end, there was material there we just didn't use. So the book would have been even bigger, but the price would have gone up. But that's part of the learning process. I mean, you go through all this. So there was interviews. But I had some of my favourite stories here, because I've been buying these things since about 1973 is my first with the Skywalder. Nightmare 17 was the one that made the first impact. I had little bits of things, Alan Class comics. But that was the one that changed things for me. And so I've been buying stuff for years. I save everything. Nothing ever gets thrown away. So we just had just a wealth of material, and especially with the independent publishers, their own back, they were just delighted, because for them it was going to put them out to a different audience, and it get more people interested in their work. So people who've given me so much pleasure over the years, and it was nice to return the compliment, really. And there was so much more that could have been in it. That's the sad thing, I think, for all of us, but we had to limit it in the end. But again, it's just with reading for so long, and you've always got your favourite stories. That's what I'm going back to at the moment. A lot of my favourites. Future projects.
Okay, so let's go back to your new book, It Crept from the Tomb. Now, as I mentioned, that first collection, the best of From the Tomb, came out in 2012.
Yeah.
And by this point, I guess you were no longer publishing the zine. How did it come about that John Morrow took an interest in what you were doing over there in the UK and decided to work with you on a best of collection?
Well, it's really down to Roy Thomas, the former Marvel editor-in-chief. Roy dropped me a line a few years ago, and he actually didn't think I'd know who he was. It was amazing how humble the man was, one of the gods of the comic book world. And he asked to have a look at it. So he said, I've been hearing about this site. So I sent Roy copies across. I think I don't know if he was in touch with Pete Crowder at PS Publishing, because they're good friends. And Roy liked what I was doing, and he said he was honest with me. He says, he enjoyed working with the horror comics as editor, but he says they weren't really my things. He says, but heroes were always his thing. I mean, he was just a dab hand at it, and he was so good at what he did. And we got on straight away, because I loved his Avengers series, his Conans. They were, I never missed those. I bought every single one I could get my hands on. And Roy pushed it John Morrow's way. He said, getting this chap on board to do things. But the timing was never right. I mean, John had a lot of other things going on. I was moored out from the tomb. It was just never right. And one went down with issue 28. I think I waited a full 12 months before I actually told people we'd gone down, because you're always living in hope something will come back and revive it. But by that stage, by about 2011, I knew it wasn't going to happen. So I just emailed all my contributors and those who'd been subscribed hold of me. I said, I'm sorry, we can't do any more. It's things have gone against us, but it's been great fun. So straight away, Pete Crowder came on me. I fancy having a shot at myself. He said, do you want to come over and have a talk about it? Great stuff. And John Morrow dropped me a line. He said, well, we talked about doing this book. He said, let's do a best of, let's collect it. I said, fantastic. I said, didn't fantastic, put that in there as well, because that'll be an incentive to people who've got everything to go and buy it, because there was some nice stuff coming up in issue 29. It was going to be a really good issue. That's what I tell people. And really, John was just very supportive. He let me have a free run on what I could include in it. He gave me, initially it was going to be 16 colour pages to 32, which was fantastic. And he just gave me a deadline. He said, can you have it ready for then? I said, yeah, I'll get it ready for then. And it was just so easy working with him. He was putting his neck on the line, because horror is a niche market. It's not, it's those who are into it, but really the big area is superheroes, and that's where TwoMorrows have done well with their superhero-related books and magazines. And this was probably a bit of a risk for him, but he gave it a go, and it works. It captured people's imaginations. I got more people interested in the old magazine. I sold a few of those. And it worked really well. And it was about, I think, when would it have been, about early 2016, I'd been notified. I asked to retire early at work because they were making cuts over here, and I was in a position where I could leave and live comfortably and do the things in life I wanted to do. And just as they give me the go-ahead, said, yeah, you can go, John came on and said, do you fancy doing another From the Tomb collection? And I couldn't believe my luck. I thought, I'm retiring from work. I've got this great life to look forward to. Do you want to do another book for us? Brilliant. And my friends and my colleagues at work were so pleased for me. And John, again, he gave me a free line, because he really wanted the book ready by the August of 2016. I said, I can't do it for then, because I'm finishing in the September, and I want to do a good handover. I want people who are following me to have everything in place, and I want to give everything to them. So it's not right. These are friends. They've looked after me for years at work, and I felt it was only right to see them right. And John was brilliant. He said, yeah, you get it right when you're ready, and we'll fit it in with our schedule. And I struggled initially. I thought I was going to retire from work, give it a few days, get things straight here, and just sit at my desk and type and design and scan things up and read up on all these things. And I couldn't do it. It was odd, and I went through a crisis, and it went on for weeks. And it was my wife who said to me, she said, it's always been a hobby. You're treating it as if it's a job now. And she said, it's never been that to you. It's always been your love. So she said, just drop John a line. Just to tell him what's going on so he's not getting worried. And John was fantastic. He said, I went through exam. He said, when it's ready, it'll be ready. And he said, you just tell me how things are going. And that spurred me on then. Once I knew John was happy, I just sat down and it all fell together. It was like 5 months, day in, day out. I mean, once you get into this, with me, it becomes an obsession. And I like everything right and I like everything done to the nth degree. I don't want to cause John problems when I'm sending stuff over to him. We're having to redo things. It went like a dream. So I've been fortunate, to have Roy on my side and then John to see, there was potential in what we were doing. So I count myself very, very fortunate.
You recount that story that you just told me in your introduction to this new book, It Crept from the Tomb, about how you had just retired. John Morrow got in touch with you, your struggles with getting it going, and then your wife suggesting that you reframe things in your own head in terms of it being a hobby instead of a full-time job. So, Peter, let me ask you, you're completely retired now, but do you see yourself retired from the horror genre and writing about it?
No, now I'm really back in. I'm retired from work. I went to the local council as a finance officer on the accountancy side. But now, once I'd done the book, was one of the things I did say to John Morrow. I said, John, I haven't done this for a while, not since really working for PS, for Pete Crowd at PS Publishing. I got the taste for it again. Once I got into that book, back to all these comics, I wanted to learn more. I'd stopped buying at one point because things were worrying we thought we were going to lose our jobs. So I'd stopped buying comics, but I've started to buy things again now purely for research and to add to my knowledge. And what I'm doing now, I've started again to build up ideas for future issues of From the Tomb. Certainly not retired from that. The taste is there again. We're seeing how the book goes. And if the book goes well enough, John has expressed an interest. He's certainly not committed himself at all. We said, well, let's have a look at it. He said, if things are going right, well, maybe. But he can't promise. He's not going to say yes. He's not going to say no. But it spurred me on to start doing things. And I'm doing it just for the absolute pleasure again. And so this afternoon, going through Skyward horror comics, the Nightmares and Psychos. I've got some French editions there that I'm going through. And I'm just back into it again. It's not saying it's taken over my life because of the things I'm doing these days as well, but the love for it is there again. I can't leave it alone.
So there may be a third volume of From the Tomb on the horizon.
Well, we don't. We discussed at one time the possibility of bringing the magazine back, to bring From the Tomb back as a magazine. But really, John wanted to see how the book would sell. Okay. He says this later this year, we'll review it and see what the situation is. But for me at the moment, if John has to, I completely understand, because he's putting his neck on the line, his money on the line, and he's got to do a lot of the work in getting it out there. I mean, he does a fantastic job with that. But for me, it's just putting all the images together again and putting the ideas together. And when you do this kind of thing, nothing's ever lost. I found that everything I've ever put together in some way or another has actually come out. So for me, yeah, it might happen. It may not do. But it doesn't matter. I'm enjoying it again. And it might be that somebody gets hold of me and says, do you fancy writing an article for me? And I'll have reams of new stuff there that I can just dip into and give them the hope for something new and interesting that people enjoy. I just enjoy it now for what it is.
Well, let's hope for success with this new book, It Crept from the Tomb, and this may be a way of, so to speak, bringing From the Tomb back from the dead.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it certainly is. I mean, that's what I am hoping for. I'd love to see it come back. But I would need somebody like John, somebody who's got the distribution. That's the, I was saying earlier, that's the big stumbling block when you go into these things. It is the distribution. If you get things right, you can recover your money through a lot of your money through having a good distributor. If somebody, they place an order for X number of copies, you can get that, and you don't want to be. I don't mind losing a bit of money. I certainly don't. I never did, but you can gauge it from that. And I'd like to think, in some way or another, I think we'll come back. Maybe it might help me out. But at the end of the day, all the money in the world, you still need a distributor, and that's what it's going to rely on, really, and whether we can get it out that way.
Well, I wish you the best of luck in that, and I hope we can see more from the Tomb in the future. Peter, thanks again for coming on the Comics Alternative and talking with me about this new book, It Crept from the Tomb.
Thank you very much, Derek. Thanks for having me on. It's very much appreciated. Thanks for your time.
Thanks again to Peter Normanton for taking the time to talk with me about his new book, It Crept from the Tomb. This is a great collection for any fan of horror comics and for critics and scholars interested in the history of comics and its surrounding fandom. And if you want to find great books like It Crept from the Tomb, then you do well to check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. As I pointed out at the top of the show, if you go to dcbservice.com right now, you'll find a variety of tomorrow's titles at great prices. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my interview with Peter Normanton. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can contact me directly. I'm Derek @comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Spotify, on TuneIn, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We've got more interviews lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.